Methamphetamine, from miracle medicine to destroyer of worlds, one molecule that changed everything. Born in Japanese laboratories over a century ago, prescribed by trusted doctors, distributed to millions of soldiers marching toward war. The compound that promised boundless energy, perfect focus, effortless confidence. Then the prescription pads closed, and the molecule found new masters. From super labs hidden in Mexican mountains to rural American towns, hollowed by despair. From Southeast Asian jungles to shattered families across every continent. A chemical so addictive that a single dose rewrites the brain's deepest priorities. Watch as dopamine floods neural circuits at 20 times natural levels. As teeth crumble. As communities collapse. As millions chase a high that destroys everything it touches. This is the story of pharmaceutical ambition, military necessity, cartel economics, and human desperation converging in crystalline form. Some molecules heal, this one consumes. The unfinished crisis, the unsolved epidemic, the chemistry of devastation. This is the complete science of methamphetamine. Before we begin, if you enjoy these types of interesting science topics, hit the like button, comment, and tell us where you are listening from. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, you know what to do. Simply subscribe. The molecule that would devastate millions began as medicine. In the final years of the 19th century, Japanese chemist Nagai Nagayoshi isolated a compound from ephedra, a plant used in traditional Chinese medicine for thousands of years. The extract, called ephedrine, treated asthma and nasal congestion by opening airways and stimulating the nervous system. But Nagai went further. He modified the molecular structure, removing a piece here, rearranging atoms there, creating something new. In 1893, he synthesized methamphetamine. The new molecule was more potent than its natural predecessor, more readily absorbed, longer lasting in the body, and more powerfully stimulating to the central nervous system. It crossed the blood-brain barrier with ease, flooding neural circuits with activity. At the time, this seemed like pharmaceutical progress, a more effective medicine derived from traditional knowledge and refined through modern chemistry. Nearly 20 years later, another chemist working in Japan crystallized the compound into a form suitable for medical use. By the early decades of the 20th century, methamphetamine entered pharmaceutical markets under various brand names. Doctors prescribed it for conditions ranging from narcolepsy to depression to obesity. The compound kept patients alert, suppressed appetite, elevated mood, and increased physical stamina. This was the era of pharmaceutical optimism, when newly synthesized compounds promised solutions to age-old human ailments. Methamphetamine joined cocaine, morphine, and amphetamine in medicine cabinets, each initially celebrated as breakthrough treatments before their darker aspects emerged. The molecular structure of methamphetamine explains its effects. It resembles neurotransmitters naturally present in the brain: dopamine, norepinephrine. Epinephrine closely enough to interact with the systems that regulate reward, attention, arousal, and movement. But unlike natural neurotransmitters, which the body carefully regulates and rapidly clears, methamphetamine persists, accumulating in synapses. Overwhelming regulatory mechanisms, flooding the brain with stimulation far beyond anything evolution prepared it to handle. This structural similarity and metabolic persistence make methamphetamine extraordinarily psychoactive. Small doses produce alertness and focus. Moderate doses generate euphoria, confidence, and boundless energy. High doses can cause psychosis, cardiovascular crisis, and seizures. The line between therapeutic and toxic is narrow, and tolerance develops quickly, pushing users toward higher doses to recapture initial effects. But in its early decades, methamphetamine appeared primarily as a tool medicine when needed, performance enhancer when desired, solution to problems of fatigue and low mood. Military forces recognized its potential immediately. World War II transformed methamphetamine from niche pharmaceutical to mass-produced military asset. Germany manufactured millions of tablets under the brand name Pervitin, distributed to soldiers to maintain alertness during long operations. Tank crews, pilots, and infantry consumed methamphetamine to fight longer without rest. The Blitzkrieg strategy, rapid, overwhelming assault requiring constant movement, was partly enabled by stimulant use among German forces. Allied nations responded in kind. Britain issued amphetamines to troops. The United States military provided millions of tablets to soldiers across theaters. Japan gave methamphetamine to pilots, including those who flew suicide missions late in the war. The compound became a weapon of endurance, pushing human bodies beyond normal limits. Soldiers returned home carrying habits formed in combat. Japan, facing economic collapse and social upheaval after defeat, experienced the first methamphetamine epidemic. Military stockpiles flooded black markets. Millions of civilians, struggling with devastation and despair, found temporary escape and energy in pills originally manufactured for soldiers. The Japanese government eventually criminalized methamphetamine and instituted strict enforcement, suppressing the epidemic over decades. But the knowledge of the molecule's power spread. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, methamphetamine remained legally available in many countries as a prescription medication. It was marketed for weight loss, marketed for depression, marketed for fatigue. Pharmaceutical companies profited, doctors prescribed liberally, and millions of people consumed methamphetamine without understanding its addictive potential. The medical establishment began recognizing problems. Reports of addiction, psychosis, cardiovascular damage, and destructive behavior patterns accumulated. By the 1970s, most countries had restricted methamphetamine to narrow medical uses, acknowledging that risks far outweighed benefits for most applications. Yet prohibition of medical use did not eliminate demand. People who had used methamphetamine for energy, weight loss, or euphoria did not simply stop when prescriptions became unavailable. Instead, production shifted from pharmaceutical laboratories to illicit operations. The molecule that began as a refinement of traditional medicine, that served as military performance enhancer, that was marketed as safe and effective treatment, became a street drug synthesized in hidden labs, distributed through criminal networks, and consumed by people increasingly desperate and marginalized. The transformation from medicine to menace was not inherent to the molecule. Methamphetamine's pharmacology remained constant. What changed was context: who used it, why they used it, how it was produced, and how society responded. The same compound that doctors once prescribed would become associated with some of the most devastating addiction patterns known, with communities torn apart, with lives destroyed. This origin story, from plant medicine to pharmaceutical product to military tool to prohibited substance, sets the stage for understanding how methamphetamine is made, distributed, and consumed today. Unlike cannabis or coca, methamphetamine has no natural source requiring cultivation. It exists only through human synthesis, created in laboratories from precursor chemicals. This makes the production process fundamentally different from plant-based drugs. There are no fields to tend, no seasonal harvests, no dependence on climate or soil. Production occurs wherever equipment, knowledge, and precursor chemicals converge. Pharmaceutical companies still manufacture methamphetamine legally in small quantities. The brand name Desoxin remains available by prescription in some countries for severe attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and obesity resistant to other treatments. Pharmaceutical production occurs in highly controlled environments with pure precursors, precise measurements, and rigorous quality control. The resulting product is consistently dosed, uncontaminated, and medically supervised. Illicit production operates without such safeguards. The shift from pharmaceutical to street production began when medical restrictions tightened. Users and opportunistic entrepreneurs realized that methamphetamine could be synthesized relatively easily compared to other drugs. The precursor chemicals, while regulated, had legitimate industrial uses, making them available through diversion or smuggling. The synthesis itself, while dangerous, could be accomplished with equipment no more sophisticated than glassware, heat sources, and basic chemicals. Early illicit production in the United States centered in the West, particularly California. Outlaw motorcycle gangs recognized methamphetamine as profitable and relatively simple to produce. Small labs appeared in rural areas, garages, motel rooms, anywhere with ventilation and privacy. These operations were dangerous, prone to explosions and toxic contamination, but enormously profitable. The chemicals required for synthesis exist in global commerce for legitimate purposes. They're used in pharmaceuticals, industrial processes, and chemical manufacturing. Regulations attempt to track and control these precursors, requiring reporting of large purchases and restricting international trade, but enforcement is incomplete. Chemical companies, legitimate and otherwise, supply gray markets. Smugglers move precursors across borders. And as regulations close access to one chemical, producers adapt, developing new synthesis routes using different precursors. This cat and mouse dynamic has continued for decades. When one precursor becomes too difficult to obtain, another method emerges. When one method becomes too dangerous or complex, simpler routes are found. The democratization of chemical knowledge through underground publications, and later, the internet, meant that synthesis techniques spread globally. What began as specialized knowledge held by trained chemists became accessible to anyone willing to learn. The scale of production evolved dramatically. Early operations were small, producing pounds at a time. Mexican trafficking organizations, recognizing demand in the United States, industrialized production. Super labs capable of producing hundreds of pounds per batch emerged in Mexico. These operations employed chemists, operated like factories, and supplied vast quantities to distribution networks spanning North America. The environmental consequences of illicit methamphetamine production are severe. The synthesis generates toxic waste for every pound of finished product. Multiple pounds of hazardous chemicals remain. Small operations dump waste in forests, rivers, and vacant lots. Contamination persists for years. Homes and buildings used as labs require expensive remediation, and some are condemned entirely. Communities bear cleanup costs, health consequences from exposure, and long-term environmental damage. Production is not centralized in any single region. While Mexico dominates supply to the United States, methamphetamine is manufactured on every inhabited continent. Southeast Asia, particularly Myanmar in the Golden Triangle region, produces massive quantities for regional markets. Eastern European operations supply Western Europe. Small-scale production continues in rural North America, though it has been largely displaced by cartel superlabs. The synthesis itself will not be detailed here, as providing actionable manufacturing instructions crosses ethical lines. What matters is understanding that methamphetamine exists because of human chemistry, not natural biology. This gives production certain advantages: no dependence on growing seasons, no need for large land areas, no vulnerability to crop eradication efforts. But it also creates unique hazards: explosions, toxic exposure, chemical burns, environmental contamination. The people who manufacture methamphetamine range from cartel employees working in industrial labs to desperate addicts cooking in makeshift setups to supplement their supply. The former operate with relative safety in controlled environments. The latter risk death from explosion, fire, or toxic exposure. Small-scale production has declined in some regions as cheap, high-purity cartel methamphetamine flooded markets, making home production economically non-viable and extraordinarily risky by comparison. The purity of the final product varies enormously. Pharmaceutical methamphetamine is essentially 100% pure. Cartel super labs produce methamphetamine of 80 to 98% purity, rivaling pharmaceutical quality. Small operations produce material of widely varying purity, often contaminated with unreacted precursors, byproducts, and cutting agents. These purity variations matter enormously for users. Higher purity means more predictable dosing, though it also means more intense effects and higher addiction potential. Lower purity introduces unpredictable substances, some inert, some toxic. Adulterants can include anything from powdered milk to battery acid, depending on the scruples and knowledge of those involved. The transformation from precursor chemicals to methamphetamine requires heat, solvents, acids, or bases, and time. Different methods produce different byproducts and require different skills. Some methods are more dangerous, others more efficient, others easier to conceal. All carry risks, both for manufacturers and for those who live nearby. As methamphetamine moves from production to distribution, it enters networks that span continents, operating through violence, corruption, and sophisticated logistics. The next chapter traces these global routes. The methamphetamine that emerges from synthesis, whether in pharmaceutical facilities or illicit labs, begins as a liquid or oily substance. To become marketable, it must be transformed into solid form through crystallization. This final step determines not just appearance but purity, potency, and desirability. Crystallization involves dissolving the product in solvent and carefully controlling temperature and evaporation. Under the right conditions, methamphetamine forms crystal's clear, glass-like structures that resemble fragments of ice or quartz. This crystalline form, called crystal meth or ice, has become the dominant form in most markets. The clarity and size of crystals signal purity to buyers, though appearance can be deceiving. The chemistry underlying methamphetamine's effects begins with its structural similarity to dopamine and norepinephrine. These neurotransmitters regulate reward, motivation, attention, and arousal. The brain carefully controls their release and reuptake, maintaining balance. Methamphetamine disrupts this balance catastrophically. When methamphetamine enters the brain, it triggers massive release of dopamine from neurons into synapses, the gaps between brain cells where chemical signaling occurs. Simultaneously, it blocks reuptake mechanisms that would normally clear dopamine away. The result is dopamine accumulation at levels 10 to 20 times higher than natural rewards produce. This flood overwhelms receptors, creating euphoria far more intense than any natural experience. But the mechanism goes further. Methamphetamine also enters neurons through dopamine transporters, traveling backward through the machinery designed to reclaim neurotransmitters. Once inside, it disrupts storage vesicles, forcing even more dopamine release. This dual action, triggering release and preventing reuptake, explains why methamphetamine produces such powerful effects. The molecule is remarkably stable in the body. While cocaine produces intense effects that fade within an hour, methamphetamine remains active for 8 to 12 hours or more. This persistence means a single dose provides prolonged stimulation. But it also means users cannot quickly reverse effects if they become overwhelming or dangerous. Methamphetamine exists in two mirror image forms called enantiomers, The dextro form is far more psychoactive than the levo form. Pharmaceutical methamphetamine is pure dextromethamphetamine. Illicit synthesis typically produces a mixture, though ratios vary by method. Higher dextro content means more intense effects on the central nervous system, while levo content contributes more to peripheral effects like increased heart rate. Different forms of methamphetamine suit different routes of consumption. Crystal can be smoked, producing effects within seconds. Powder can be snorted with effects in minutes. Pills can be swallowed, with effects in 20 to 30 minutes. All forms can be dissolved and injected, producing the most intense and rapid effects but also carrying the highest risks. The transformation from synthesis to final product also involves adulterants in illicit markets. Cutting agents stretch supply and increase profits. Some are relatively inert: powdered milk, baking soda, or glucose. Others mimic certain effects: caffeine for stimulation, other stimulants to enhance potency. Still others are simply whatever is available. Quality control is non-existent. Purity testing requires equipment and knowledge most buyers lack. One particularly concerning development is the increasing purity of methamphetamine in markets supplied by Mexican cartels. Sophisticated production techniques and economy of scale mean that crystal methamphetamine now commonly exceeds 90% purity. While this eliminates concerns about toxic adulterants, it also means users are consuming an extremely potent product. The margin for error in dosing becomes razor thin, and addiction develops with terrifying speed. Pharmaceutical methamphetamine, sold as disoxin, comes in 5 milligram tablets. A typical prescription dose might be 5 to 10 milligrams daily. Street methamphetamine users commonly consume doses 5 to 10 times higher, sometimes multiple times per day. This difference between carefully calibrated medical use and uncontrolled recreational use illustrates how the same molecule becomes entirely different substances in practice. The chemistry of addiction is written into methamphetamine's molecular structure. The massive dopamine release it causes teaches the brain that methamphetamine is more important than food, water, sex, or any natural reward. Neural circuits are hijacked, priorities distorted. The brain adapts to chronic flooding by downregulating dopamine receptors and reducing natural dopamine production. This adaptation means that, over time, users need methamphetamine just to feel normal, while natural rewards become increasingly unable to produce pleasure. This is why methamphetamine addiction is so severe and recovery so difficult. The brain has been fundamentally altered. Restoring normal function requires months or years of abstinence, and some changes may be permanent. Environmental impact from production extends beyond the synthesis itself. The chemicals used are often disposed of improperly, contaminating soil and water. Homes used as labs absorb toxic fumes into walls, carpets, and ventilation systems. Children living in or near production sites suffer exposure to toxic chemicals, causing respiratory problems, developmental issues, and poisoning. Precursor chemical regulations have become increasingly sophisticated, tracking purchases and flagging suspicious patterns. But the chemical industry is vast and global. Diversion occurs at many points from manufacturers to distributors to retailers. International cooperation attempts to stem flows, but enforcement is uneven, and corruption undermines controls. The journey from precursor chemicals to consumable methamphetamine involves chemistry that is elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its consequences. The molecule, once created, enters networks that move it across borders, through cities, into communities already struggling with poverty, trauma, and limited resources. The first methamphetamine epidemic struck Japan in the aftermath of World War II. Military stockpiles, no longer needed for combat. Flooded black markets. Production facilities continued operating, redirecting output from military to civilian markets. At the peak, estimates suggest that 5% of Japan's population used methamphetamine. The social disruption was catastrophic. Crime surged, productivity collapsed, families disintegrated. Japan's response was aggressive and sustained. Strict criminalization, intensive enforcement, and public health campaigns gradually suppressed the epidemic over 2 decades. By the 1970s, methamphetamine use in Japan had declined dramatically, though it never disappeared entirely. Meanwhile, methamphetamine use in the United States followed a different trajectory. Post-war prescription use was widespread, particularly for weight loss and mood elevation. Truck drivers used it to stay alert on long hauls. Students used it to study. Housewives used it to manage domestic demands while maintaining slim figures. Pharmaceutical companies marketed it aggressively, downplaying addiction risks. When prescriptions became harder to obtain in the 1970s, illicit production filled the gap. Outlaw motorcycle gangs, particularly the Hells Angels and their associates, dominated early production and distribution. These groups operated small labs in rural areas of California and the Southwest, producing methamphetamine that became known as crank or speed. The product was relatively crude, often colored or contaminated, but demand was strong. The 1980s saw methamphetamine use concentrated in specific demographics: working-class whites, truckers, bikers, rural populations. The drug's association with these groups meant it received less media attention and less aggressive law enforcement response than crack cocaine, which was associated with black urban communities. This disparity in response illustrates how drug policy reflects social prejudices as much as public health concerns. Mexican trafficking organizations began entering the methamphetamine trade in the 1990s. They brought industrial scale and sophisticated logistics honed through marijuana and cocaine trafficking. Super labs emerged in Sinaloa, Jalisco, and other Mexican states. These facilities could produce hundreds of pounds per batch, with purity approaching pharmaceutical grade. The cartel's entry transformed methamphetamine markets. Prices dropped as supply increased. Purity rose dramatically. Small-scale domestic production could not compete with cheap, high-quality cartel product. By the 2000s, Mexican cartels controlled the overwhelming majority of methamphetamine in the United States. Distribution networks mirrored those used for other drugs: bulk shipments across the border, regional distribution hubs, local dealers. But methamphetamine had advantages from a trafficking perspective. It is not odorous like marijuana, making it easier to conceal. It does not require the violence associated with controlling cocaine routes, as production could occur closer to consumer markets. And demand was strong and growing. The methamphetamine crisis, initially concentrated in the West and rural areas, spread eastward and into urban centers. By the 2010s, methamphetamine was available nationwide, competing with and complementing the opioid epidemic. Some users turned to methamphetamine after opioids left them unable to function, seeking stimulant effects to counteract sedation. Others used both, alternating or combining in dangerous polydrug patterns. Internationally, Southeast Asia emerged as another major production center. Myanmar, in the Golden Triangle region long associated with opium production, became the world's largest methamphetamine producer. Armed groups controlling border areas operated labs producing billions of pills annually, supplying Thailand, China, and other regional markets. Pills, often branded with logos, contained methamphetamine mixed with caffeine and sometimes other substances. These pills, called yaba in Thailand, became widespread among young people and laborers. Eastern Europe also developed production capacity, supplying Western European markets. Czech Republic, in particular, became known for methamphetamine production, though enforcement efforts and precursor regulations eventually reduced this. Production shifted to mobile labs and border regions where enforcement was weaker. Precursor chemical trafficking became a parallel trade. As regulations tightened, smuggling networks adapted. Chinese chemical companies supplied precursors to Mexican cartels. African nations became transshipment points. Shell companies and falsified documents obscured the trail. International cooperation attempted to track and intercept precursors, but the global chemical industry's complexity provided countless opportunities for diversion. The economics of methamphetamine trafficking are driven by the drug's profitability. Production costs are relatively low. Precursor chemicals, equipment, and skilled labor are all available. Bulk methamphetamine might cost trafficking organizations $500 to $1,000 per pound to produce. That same pound, broken down and sold retail, generates tens of thousands of dollars. Profit margins rival or exceed those of other drugs. Violence associated with methamphetamine trafficking is less than with cocaine or heroin, in part because production can be more dispersed and less territorial. However, Mexican cartels have fought over production capacity and distribution networks, contributing to broader cartel violence. In Southeast Asia, methamphetamine trade funds armed groups and fuels ongoing conflicts. The route from superlab to street dealer involves multiple levels. Cartels sell multi-kilogram quantities to regional distributors. These distributors break down loads into pounds, selling to local networks. Local networks further divide the product, with each level adding markup. By the time methamphetamine reaches individual users, prices have multiplied many times over, though they remain relatively affordable compared to opioids or cocaine. Law enforcement efforts to disrupt trafficking have had limited success. Seizures of multi-hundred-pound shipments make headlines, but barely dent supply. Superlabs, when discovered and destroyed, are replaced within weeks. The economic incentives are simply too strong, and demand remains robust. The global methamphetamine trade now involves production on at least 3 continents, distribution networks in virtually every country, and consumption by millions. The routes are not fixed but fluid, adapting to enforcement pressure, exploiting weaknesses, and following profit. The molecule travels from rural Mexican labs to American suburbs, from Southeast Asian jungles to Australian cities, from Czech border towns to German clubs. This global dimension means that local enforcement cannot solve methamphetamine problems. The supply chain is too long, too adaptable, too profitable. Demand reduction, addressing why people use methamphetamine, remains the only approach with potential for lasting impact. But that requires confronting poverty, trauma, mental illness, and social fragmentation, challenges far more complex than interdicting drugs. As methamphetamine arrives in communities, its impact depends on context, culture, and available support systems. The next chapter explores what methamphetamine looks like in the hands of consumers. Methamphetamine reaches consumers in several forms, each associated with different routes of administration and cultural contexts. The most common is crystal methamphetamine, clear or slightly cloudy crystals ranging from small fragments to chunks several inches across. This form is typically smoked, the preferred method in most contemporary markets. Powder methamphetamine, less common now but still available, is typically white or off-white and can be snorted or dissolved for injection. Pills containing methamphetamine circulate in some markets, particularly in Southeast Asia. Pharmaceutical methamphetamine comes in small, precisely dosed tablets, rarely diverted to illicit markets due to tight controls and limited production. Street names vary by region and era. Crystal meth, ice, glass, crank, speed, meth all refer to methamphetamine in different forms or contexts. The terminology reflects marketing, culture, and the need for coded language to discuss illegal substances. Smoking methamphetamine became dominant because it produces immediate, intense effects. Users heat crystals in glass pipes, inhaling the vapor. Absorption through lungs is rapid, sending methamphetamine to the brain within seconds. The rush, an overwhelming wave of euphoria and energy, is described by users as unmatched by any other experience. This intensity makes smoking highly addictive. Snorting produces effects within minutes rather than seconds. The onset is less intense, but lasts longer. This method damages nasal tissues with chronic use, causing perforation and chronic pain. Injection produces effects between smoking and snorting in onset, extremely intense but requiring venous access and carrying risks of infection, disease transmission, and vascular damage. Oral consumption produces the slowest onset and least intense high but longest duration. This method is closest to pharmaceutical use, though street doses are typically far higher than medical doses. Some users prefer oral consumption to avoid the intensity and compulsive redosing associated with smoking. The methamphetamine epidemic in the United States has two distinct geographic and demographic patterns. Rural areas, particularly in the West, Midwest, and South, experienced devastation beginning in the 1990s. These were communities already struggling with economic decline, lack of opportunities, and social isolation. Methamphetamine offered escape, temporary energy, confidence, and euphoria that made intolerable circumstances bearable. Small towns saw families torn apart, children entering foster care in unprecedented numbers, crime rates surging, and infrastructure, hospitals, schools, social services overwhelmed. The rural meth epidemic received less attention than urban crack cocaine epidemics, reflecting biases in media coverage and policy attention. Urban methamphetamine use follows different patterns. In cities, methamphetamine use is concentrated in specific communities, particularly among men who have sex with men. Chemsex, the use of methamphetamine and other drugs to facilitate prolonged sexual activity, became widespread in some urban gay communities. Methamphetamine lowers inhibitions, increases libido, and allows marathon sexual sessions. It also increases HIV transmission risk through higher-risk sexual behaviors and impaired judgment. This pattern reflects multiple factors: social marginalization, trauma, seeking connection and pleasure in contexts where stigma and discrimination create barriers. Harm reduction efforts in these communities focus on safe sex practices, HIV prevention, overdose prevention, and non-judgmental support services. Among women, methamphetamine use often intersects with domestic violence, sexual exploitation, and involvement in the sex trade. The drug's appetite-suppressing effects appeal to those struggling with body image issues or eating disorders. But methamphetamine use makes users vulnerable to exploitation and violence, trapping many in cycles difficult to escape. Methamphetamine use among young people, while lower than alcohol or marijuana, is concerning because of the drug's severe addiction potential. Adolescent brains, still developing, are particularly vulnerable to methamphetamine's neurotoxic effects. Early initiation strongly predicts chronic use and poor outcomes. The distinction between pharmaceutical and street methamphetamine matters enormously. Digoxin, when properly prescribed and monitored, helps some patients with ADHD or treatment-resistant obesity. Doses are low, use is supervised, and addiction risk is managed. Street methamphetamine, used in much higher doses, without medical supervision, and often combined with other substances, causes devastation. Socioeconomic factors shape methamphetamine use patterns. The drug is associated with poverty, unemployment, unstable housing, and lack of opportunity. Communities with limited resources, where people face chronic stress and limited prospects, show higher rates of methamphetamine use. This is not coincidental. Methamphetamine offers temporary relief from hopelessness, however destructive. The price of methamphetamine has declined dramatically, even as purity increased. In the early 2000s, a gram of crystal might cost $100 or more. Today, in many markets, prices have dropped to $30 to $50 per gram for high-purity product. This makes methamphetamine accessible to even the poorest users, contributing to its spread. Adulterants in street methamphetamine have become less common as cartel superlabs produce such high-purity product that cutting it reduces rather than increases profit. However, some methamphetamine is contaminated with manufacturing byproducts or deliberately mixed with other stimulants. Testing is rarely available to street users who must trust dealers or rely on appearance and effects to judge purity. The cultural context of methamphetamine use varies globally. In Thailand, yaba pills are consumed by laborers seeking energy for long shifts. In the United States, crystal meth is associated with binge use, days-long sessions of repeated dosing. In parts of Europe, methamphetamine is used in club scenes, though MDMA and cocaine are more common. Each context shapes patterns of use, risks, and consequences. Indigenous communities in some regions have been disproportionately affected by methamphetamine. Reservations and tribal lands often lack adequate law enforcement, treatment resources, and economic opportunities. Methamphetamine enters these communities and devastates them, compounding historical trauma and ongoing marginalization. Methamphetamine in consumer hands is a substance of extremes, offering unmatched euphoria, followed by crushing despair, boundless energy followed by incapacitating exhaustion, intense pleasure followed by severe addiction. As the drug enters the body, its effects unfold with devastating power. The methamphetamine molecule, once inhaled, snorted, injected, or swallowed, moves through the body with remarkable efficiency. Smoked methamphetamine reaches the brain within 10 to 15 seconds. Injected, it arrives almost as quickly. Snorted or swallowed, the journey takes minutes, but the destination is the same: neural circuits governing reward, arousal, and motivation. The blood-brain barrier, which protects the brain from many substances, permits methamphetamine entry readily. Once inside, the molecule disperses throughout brain tissue, concentrating in regions dense with dopamine neurons, the nucleus accumbens, ventral tegmental area, and prefrontal cortex. The immediate effect is dopamine release, on a scale the brain never experiences naturally. Sexual orgasm, delicious food, unexpected reward, all produce dopamine spikes. Methamphetamine produces releases 10 to 20 times higher. Every reward circuit fires simultaneously and intensely, creating euphoria so overwhelming that users describe it as transcendent. The rush, particularly when smoking or injecting, is a full-body experience. Users report a wave of pleasure rolling through them, accompanied by intense focus, boundless confidence, and the feeling that everything is possible. Heart rate soars, blood pressure spikes, breathing quickens, pupils dilate. The body is flooded with norepinephrine and epinephrine, stress hormones that prepare for action. Subjectively, time distorts. Hours feel like minutes. Attention becomes laser-focused or scattered across multiple tasks simultaneously. Speech accelerates, Movement becomes rapid, sometimes jerky. Sexual desire intensifies. Appetite vanishes completely. Sleep becomes impossible. This acute phase can last 8 to 12 hours from a single dose, far longer than cocaine or most other stimulants. Users often redose during this period, chasing the initial rush or maintaining the high. Binge use continuous dosing over days is common, during which users forego food and sleep entirely. The cardiovascular system experiences severe stress. Methamphetamine increases heart rate, often to dangerous levels. Blood vessels constrict, raising blood pressure. This combination strains the heart, increasing risk of arrhythmia, heart attack, and sudden cardiac death. Young, otherwise healthy users have died from methamphetamine-induced cardiac events. Body temperature rises, sometimes dramatically. Hyperthermia can reach dangerous levels, causing organ damage and death. Combined with physical activity, dancing, sexual activity, repetitive movements, overheating becomes life-threatening. Users often fail to recognize they are dangerously overheated because the drug impairs judgment and perception. The drug's effects on sexuality are complex. Libido increases dramatically. Inhibitions dissolve. Sexual activity can continue for hours, sometimes days in binge use contexts. But prolonged use causes sexual dysfunction. Men experience difficulty achieving erection. Women experience decreased lubrication. Orgasm becomes difficult or impossible. This paradox traps users. Sex feels incredibly important and desirable, but the drug makes it increasingly difficult to achieve satisfaction. Risky sexual behavior under methamphetamine's influence contributes to HIV and sexually transmitted infection transmission. Impaired judgment, lowered inhibitions, and diminished concern for consequences lead to unprotected sex, multiple partners, and situations where violence or exploitation occur. Methamphetamine's appetite suppression is profound. Users can go days without eating, losing dramatic amounts of weight. This was why it was prescribed for obesity, but the mechanism is hijacking hunger circuits. The body still needs nutrition, but the brain no longer signals hunger. Chronic users become severely malnourished, weakening immune systems and exacerbating other health problems. Sleep deprivation during binge use causes its own cascade of problems. After several days without sleep, hallucinations begin. Paranoia intensifies. Cognitive function deteriorates. Some users experience stimulant psychosis, a state indistinguishable from schizophrenia, with paranoid delusions, auditory hallucinations, and disorganized thinking. This typically resolves with sleep and abstinence, but can be terrifying and dangerous. The crash, when methamphetamine effects finally wear off, is brutal. Users describe profound exhaustion, depression, anxiety, and intense cravings. The brain, depleted of dopamine and other neurotransmitters, cannot generate normal pleasure or motivation. Everything feels gray, empty, purposeless. This crash drives compulsive use. Consuming more methamphetamine immediately relieves these symptoms, reinforcing addiction. Acute withdrawal from methamphetamine is not medically dangerous like alcohol or benzodiazepine withdrawal, but it is psychologically agonizing. Depression can be severe enough to trigger suicidal thoughts. Fatigue is overwhelming. Users may sleep for days during initial withdrawal. Appetite returns ravenously. Cognitive function remains impaired. Concentration, memory, and decision-making are all compromised. These withdrawal symptoms peak within the first week and gradually improve over weeks to months. But some users experience protracted withdrawal, low-level depression, anhedonia, and cravings that persists for many months, making sustained recovery extraordinarily difficult. The drug's metabolism varies by individual, but typically involves liver enzymes breaking down methamphetamine over many hours. Unlike cocaine, which is rapidly metabolized, methamphetamine persists. Half-life: the time for half the drug to be eliminated is roughly 10 to 12 hours. This means effects last long after use, and repeated dosing causes accumulation in the body. Tolerance develops rapidly with regular use. The intense euphoria of initial use becomes harder to achieve. Users escalate doses, seeking to recapture that first experience, but the brain adapts, down-regulating dopamine receptors, reducing dopamine production, and becoming less responsive. This adaptation means higher and higher doses are needed for diminishing effects, while the crash and withdrawal worsen. Methamphetamine does not affect everyone identically. Genetics influence metabolism, receptor density, and vulnerability to addiction. Some users develop severe problems quickly. Others maintain controlled use for longer periods before escalating. But the trajectory is generally downward. Methamphetamine's pharmacology makes addiction nearly inevitable with continued use. The immediate effects, euphoria, energy, confidence, are so rewarding that they override survival instincts. Food, sleep, safety, relationships all become secondary to obtaining and using more methamphetamine. This is addiction at its most severe, rewriting priorities at a fundamental neurological level. As acute effects give way to chronic patterns, long-term damage accumulates. The next chapter examines what happens when methamphetamine use extends over months and years. Methamphetamine addiction is among the most severe and destructive of all substance use disorders. The drug's pharmacology: massive dopamine release, long duration, intense euphoria creates psychological dependence with remarkable speed. Many users report feeling addicted after first use, recognizing that they would do almost anything to experience that high again. The addiction progresses in stages. Initial use produces overwhelming positive effects with minimal negative consequences. This honeymoon period varies in length but eventually gives way to tolerance and increased use. As tolerance develops, the positive effects diminish while negative effects intensify. Users find themselves consuming methamphetamine, not for pleasure, but to avoid the crushing depression and exhaustion of withdrawal. At this stage, life becomes organized around methamphetamine. Employment, relationships, health, and responsibilities all deteriorate. The compulsive pattern of use: binge for days, crash, wake, and use again makes sustained functioning impossible. Users lose jobs, housing, custody of children. Criminal behavior to fund use becomes common. The trajectory is relentlessly downward. Neurotoxicity from chronic methamphetamine use causes lasting brain damage. Dopamine and serotonin neurons are particularly vulnerable. Imaging studies show reduced dopamine transporter density in the brains of chronic users, indicating neuronal damage. Cognitive functions decline: memory, attention, executive function, and impulse control all deteriorate. Some recovery occurs with prolonged abstinence, but deficits can persist for years or permanently. This cognitive damage makes recovery even more difficult. The very brain functions needed to make good decisions, resist impulses, and plan for the future are impaired by the drug. Users know methamphetamine is destroying their lives, but feel unable to stop, trapped by damaged neural circuits. The physical manifestations of chronic methamphetamine use are stark. Meth mouth, severe dental decay, and tooth loss results from dry mouth, teeth grinding, poor hygiene, and possible direct effects of the drug on dental tissue. Users lose teeth rapidly, sometimes all of them. The social stigma and health consequences are severe. Skin damage is another visible sign. Users develop sores from picking at skin, convinced that insects or particles are beneath the surface. This is a form of tactile hallucination or delusional parasitosis. The sores become infected, heal slowly, and leave scars. Combined with weight loss and poor nutrition, chronic users appear gaunt, aged far beyond their years. Cardiovascular damage accumulates. Repeated stress on the heart and blood vessels causes cardiomyopathy, weakening of heart muscle, and increases risk of stroke. Young methamphetamine users experience cardiovascular events at rates typical of people decades older. Some damage is irreversible. Respiratory damage occurs in those who smoke methamphetamine. Lung function declines. Chronic cough, wheezing, and increased infection risk mirror effects of tobacco smoking. The damage is compounded if users also smoke tobacco or other substances. Infectious disease risk is elevated, particularly among those who inject. HIV and hepatitis C transmission through needle sharing remains a major public health concern. But even non-injecting users face increased infection risk due to suppressed immune function, poor hygiene, and risky sexual behavior. Mental health consequences extend beyond the immediate psychosis and paranoia of intoxication. Chronic methamphetamine use is associated with anxiety disorders, depression, and persistent psychotic symptoms. Some users develop methamphetamine-induced psychosis that continues long after cessation of use, requiring antipsychotic medication and psychiatric care. The question of whether methamphetamine causes psychosis or those prone to psychosis are more likely to use methamphetamine is debated. The evidence suggests both occur. Methamphetamine can trigger psychosis in vulnerable individuals, while people with emerging psychotic disorders may self-medicate with stimulants. Violence and aggression increase with methamphetamine use. The paranoia, impulsivity, and grandiosity the drug produces can lead to violent confrontations. Domestic violence rates are elevated among methamphetamine users. Child abuse and neglect are tragically common. The stimulant-induced aggression combined with poor judgment creates dangerous situations. Sexual exploitation is common, particularly among women who use methamphetamine. The drug lowers inhibitions and increases libido, while also impairing judgment about safety and consent. Many users engage in transactional sex to fund their use. The cycle of addiction, exploitation, and trauma becomes self-reinforcing. Pregnancy and methamphetamine use pose severe risks. The drug crosses the placental barrier, exposing fetuses to stimulant effects. Babies born to mothers using methamphetamine may be premature, low birth weight, or experience withdrawal symptoms. Long-term developmental effects are concerning, though research is complicated by polydrug use and other factors. Recovery from methamphetamine addiction is extraordinarily difficult. The brain damage, psychological dependence, and life circumstances that develop during active addiction create enormous barriers. Users who achieve abstinence often relapse within weeks or months. The depression and anhedonia of protracted withdrawal make staying clean feel impossible. Treatment approaches include behavioral therapies, cognitive behavioral therapy, contingency management, and support groups. Unlike opioid addiction, there are no medications that specifically treat methamphetamine addiction, though research continues. Some medications address co-occurring mental health conditions or help manage withdrawal symptoms, but no pharmacological substitute or blocker exists. Residential treatment programs offer structure and separation from drug-using environments, improving outcomes compared to outpatient treatment alone. But treatment capacity is limited, and many users lack insurance or resources to access quality care. Harm reduction approaches focus on keeping users alive and healthier while recognizing that abstinence may not be immediately achievable. Needle exchange programs, safe consumption spaces, and education about safer use practices reduce HIV transmission, overdose deaths, and other harms. These approaches remain controversial and unavailable in many regions. Compared to other stimulants, methamphetamine is particularly destructive. Cocaine's shorter duration means less sleep deprivation and cardiovascular stress per use episode, though cocaine addiction is also severe. Prescription stimulants like Adderall, when used as prescribed, pose far lower risks than street methamphetamine due to controlled dosing and medical supervision. But prescription stimulant misuse can also lead to addiction and health consequences. The death rate from methamphetamine, while lower than opioids, is rising. Cardiovascular events, suicide, accidents, violence, and interactions with other drugs all contribute. Methamphetamine is increasingly found in combination with opioids, a particularly dangerous polydrug pattern where stimulant and depressant effects mask each other, increasing overdose risk. The tragedy of methamphetamine addiction is how quickly and completely it can destroy lives. A functioning person can become severely addicted and completely destabilized within months. The road back is long, uncertain, and requires resources and support often unavailable to those most affected. This brings the narrative to its final chapter: the broader human and social dimensions of the methamphetamine crisis. Methamphetamine's journey from pharmaceutical innovation to devastating crisis reflects human patterns repeated across substances and societies. The search for solutions to suffering, the unintended consequences of powerful technologies, the interaction between molecules and social conditions, and the failure of purely punitive approaches to drug problems. The molecule itself is neutral. In controlled medical contexts, it helps some patients function. But in the chaos of illicit markets, poverty, and despair, it becomes an agent of destruction. This difference is not in the chemistry, but in context. The communities hardest hit by methamphetamine are those already struggling. Rural areas experiencing economic collapse, deindustrialization, and population loss saw methamphetamine fill a void. Young people with limited opportunities, older workers displaced by economic changes, families under financial strain all found temporary escape in methamphetamine's promise of energy and euphoria. This is not coincidental. Substance use patterns reflect social conditions. When life offers hope, opportunity, and connection, addiction rates are lower. When communities are fractured, economies failing, and futures uncertain, substance use rises. Methamphetamine did not cause rural decline. It exploited and exacerbated conditions that already existed. The response to methamphetamine has been predominantly criminalization. Millions have been arrested for possession, manufacturing, or distribution. Mandatory minimum sentences have imprisoned people for decades. Asset forfeiture has stripped users and their families of property. Yet methamphetamine remains widely available. Purity is higher than ever, and addiction continues devastating communities. This failure mirrors broader failures of the war on drugs. Prohibition creates black markets, enriching criminals while pushing users into shadows where help is hardest to access. Criminalization stigmatizes addiction, making users less likely to seek treatment. Imprisonment traumatizes individuals and destabilizes families without addressing underlying causes of use. Harm reduction approaches offer alternatives. Needle exchange programs reduce HIV transmission. Safe consumption sites prevent overdose deaths. Medication-assisted treatment for co-occurring opioid addiction helps stabilize users. Testing services allow users to know purity and avoid contaminated substances. These approaches recognize that criminalization has failed and that keeping people alive and healthier is the foundation for eventual recovery. But harm reduction remains controversial, opposed by those who view it as enabling drug use. This tension between pragmatic public health approaches and moralistic punitive approaches defines drug policy debates. The evidence supports harm reduction, but politics often prevents implementation. The pharmaceutical industry bears responsibility for methamphetamine's trajectory. Aggressive marketing of methamphetamine for weight loss and mood elevation in the mid-20th century created widespread use and addiction before risks were fully understood or acknowledged. The pattern mirrors more recent opioid crises, where pharmaceutical companies downplayed addiction risks to maximize profits. Now, the same industry researches treatments for methamphetamine addiction, seeking to profit from solving a problem their predecessors helped create. The irony is stark. Whether genuinely effective treatments emerge remains to be seen. Media representations of methamphetamine users have been overwhelmingly stigmatizing. Images of meth mouth, dramatic before and after photos, and stories emphasizing criminality and depravity have shaped public perception. This stigma makes users less likely to seek help, more likely to be discriminated against in employment and housing, and easier to dismiss as unworthy of compassion or resources. The reality is that people who use methamphetamine are complex human beings with histories, trauma, hopes, and value. Many are parents desperately trying to hold families together. Some are veterans struggling with PTSD. Others are young people seeking belonging and escape from abuse. Reducing them to their substance use denies their humanity and makes solutions harder to envision. Indigenous communities have been particularly devastated. Historical trauma, ongoing discrimination, poverty, and lack of resources create conditions where methamphetamine use spirals into epidemic levels. Tribal health systems, underfunded and overwhelmed, struggle to provide treatment. The intergenerational impact compounds historical harms. LGBTQ+ communities face specific challenges around methamphetamine. Chemsex culture in some urban gay communities has normalized use, making it difficult for individuals to recognize problematic patterns or seek help without losing social connections. Stigma around both sexual orientation and drug use creates barriers to care. Culturally competent treatment services are limited. The economic cost of methamphetamine is enormous. Healthcare expenses, criminal justice costs, lost productivity, child welfare interventions, and environmental cleanup total billions annually. But these figures, while staggering, fail to capture the human cost. Childhoods destroyed, families torn apart, potential unrealized, lives lost. Children growing up in homes where methamphetamine is used or manufactured experience trauma with lasting effects. Neglect, abuse, exposure to violence, and instability shape development in profoundly harmful ways. Foster care systems in heavily affected regions are overwhelmed. The intergenerational transmission of trauma and addiction continues cycles difficult to break. Treatment capacity remains woefully inadequate. Most users who want treatment cannot access it due to cost, lack of facilities, or waiting lists. Those who do access treatment often receive inadequate care, too short duration, insufficient intensity, no follow-up support. Sustained recovery typically requires comprehensive services: health care, mental health treatment, housing, employment support, and community connection. Such wraparound services are rare. Prevention efforts focus on education, though evidence for effectiveness is mixed. Teaching young people about drug risks is important, but if underlying conditions driving use, trauma, poverty, lack of opportunity, are not addressed, knowledge alone provides limited protection. the future of methamphetamine policy is uncertain. Some jurisdictions are moving toward decriminalization, recognizing that criminal approaches have failed. Oregon's model treats possession as a civil violation rather than crime, directing people toward services rather than jail. Portugal decriminalized all drugs decades ago, coupling policy change with investment in treatment and harm reduction, and has seen positive outcomes. But political will for such reforms is uneven. Many regions continue punitive approaches despite evidence of failure. The moral framework viewing addiction as personal failing rather than health condition persists, blocking policy changes that evidence supports. Research into methamphetamine addiction treatments continues. Vaccines that prevent methamphetamine from entering the brain are in development. Medications that modulate dopamine systems or reduce cravings show some promise in trials. But even with pharmaceutical treatments, recovery requires addressing social factors: housing, employment, relationships, purpose. The methamphetamine molecule will persist. Chemistry does not change. What can change is how societies respond, whether with punishment or compassion, criminalization or treatment, stigma or support. The trajectory of past decades suggests that without fundamental shifts in approach, the crisis will continue. The human story of methamphetamine is ultimately about suffering and the search for relief. People use methamphetamine because it offers escape, however temporary, from pain. That pain has many sources: economic insecurity, trauma, mental illness, isolation, hopelessness. Until those underlying conditions are addressed, substances offering escape will find users. Methamphetamine is a particularly destructive escape. The molecule's pharmacology makes addiction almost inevitable, and the health consequences are severe. But condemning people for seeking relief from unbearable circumstances, or believing that punishment will solve problems rooted in social conditions, has proven futile. The path forward requires recognizing addiction as a health condition, providing evidence-based treatment on demand, implementing harm reduction to prevent deaths and disease, addressing social determinants of drug use, and building communities where people have hope, connection, and purpose. This is harder than interdicting drugs or imprisoning users. It requires confronting systemic failures and making long-term investments in human well-being. But it is the only approach that addresses root causes rather than symptoms. The molecule remains unchanged from its first synthesis more than a century ago. What has changed is the world around it, the markets, the policies, the social conditions, the responses. The methamphetamine crisis is, ultimately, a human crisis. The solutions, if they come, will be human solutions, emerging from compassion, evidence, and the recognition that behind every statistic is a person whose life has value and whose suffering demands response. The story of methamphetamine is not finished. In communities across the globe, people struggle with addiction, families search for treatment, policymakers debate responses, and the molecule continues its journey from lab to street to brain, leaving devastation and occasionally recovery in its wake. How this story evolves depends on choices societies make, whether to continue approaches that have failed or embrace those that evidence supports, whether to stigmatize or support, whether to punish or heal.